All right, good afternoon. I have the pleasure of introducing our Grand Round speaker. She has no financial interest conflict that we are aware of. Nosheen Ranjbar is currently a chief resident at the University of Arizona Department of Psychiatry. Her focus is on integrative psychiatry and mind-body medicine, and she's currently receiving training through the Center for Mind-Body Medicine. She's been facilitating mind-body medicine skills groups in our outpatient clinic since July, and she has also been involved in initiating a new program of mind-body medicine outreach for Native American populations in the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. Her main interest is learning about and working with trauma healing. She's originally from Iran and moved to the U.S. at age 12. She completed her medical training at University of Virginia, and following some training in family medicine and integrative medicine, and a few years of clinical research on brain neuroplasticity at Yale University, she joined us in the Department of Psychiatry a few years ago. Upon graduation in June 2012, she will be pursuing a child and adolescent fellowship at the Children's Hospital in Boston. Her future goal is to pursue mind-body medicine with work with children and youth, and eventually help create an integrative models of trauma healing for special populations, including Native Americans and refugees. Please welcome Nosheen Ranjbar.
Thank you, Dr. Heron, and all of you for joining us this afternoon. Are the lights going to get dimmed? So it is my honor to be here and to speak regarding something that has become quite dear to my heart, which is studying trauma spectrum disorders and various modalities that are being looked at as possible treatment modalities for this spectrum of diseases that have been quite disabling and causing a lot of distress for a lot of children, youth, and adults. I'm going to start with a case summary of a gentleman that I met about a year ago. Daniel is a 57-year-old Vietnam veteran with a diagnosis of chronic severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He struggled with flashbacks, nightmares, and hypervigilance for decades. When asked about his most troubling symptoms, he stated, "The spirit of a man whom I killed in battle continues to follow me around." He mentioned that the guilt he felt was even more pronounced as he found out that the man had been a shamanic healer. He described the experience as terrifying, unbearable, and making his life not worth living. He had tried multiple treatments, including medications, years of individual and group therapy through the VA hospital, all unfortunately with minimal relief. He continued to struggle with his disability and significantly compromised functioning. Daniel reported that after many years, he was invited to participate in a Native American healing ceremony facilitated by a Lakota elder and medicine man. He decided to attend. He reported that during the ceremony, he noticed that, as usual, the ghost of the dead shaman accompanied him. During the ceremony, the medicine man invited those present to think of someone they would like to ask forgiveness from and someone they would like to forgive. It was an easy decision for Daniel, the dead shaman. As the drumbeat and chanting by the musicians continued, Daniel sat on the floor, tears flowing down his face, and he communed with the image of the dead shaman. He sobbed as he asked for forgiveness for what he had done, and in turn forgave the ghost that had been haunting him over the years. The medicine man went around smudging the participants with sage, honoring the intense experience they were having. I met Daniel at a Lakota seminar years later. At one point, the participants were asked if anyone had a testimony to share. Daniel shared the following. "Something shifted for me during that ceremony. The shaman's ghost was there with me, but I noticed it was as if he was also participating in the ceremony instead of haunting me. During the forgiveness and cleansing ritual, I bowed before him, Daniel said, and asked him for forgiveness as tears rolled down my face. It was as if his eyes and face softened, slowly transformed from that terrifying ghost who had followed me everywhere for years. Then the ceremony ended. Daniel continued, "My symptoms have improved considerably. I'm able to work and function now in a way I never thought possible. I've been able to connect with my family and make friends again." Someone from the audience asked Daniel if the shaman's ghost still followed him. Daniel smiled and said, "Yes, but he is now my best friend." So with that, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about trauma, its definition, psychoneuroimmunology, the notion of trauma spectrum disorders, current views, an overview of treatment modalities, and then spend some time on the notion of ceremony and ritual, its definition, its historical perspectives, the varieties that exist in the world, and then its role in the treatment of trauma spectrum disorders, some research findings thus far, and remaining questions and further research. Trauma comes from the Latin word meaning wound. In some instances, it can be referring to a physical wound, and in this instance, we're talking about psychological wounds. The historical definition is that trauma is an extremely stressful experience, bringing up vehement emotions, overwhelming the ability of the individual to use normal coping mechanisms to adapt. And it usually disrupts the frame of reference if not resolved for that person. So situations they come to that normally would not be completely stressful and overwhelming become so because of this disruption of the frame of reference. And then there's an evolving definition for the word trauma, and this partly comes from the work of Dr. Peter Skaer, who wrote the book, The Trauma Spectrum, we'll talk about in a little bit. But he defines trauma as a continuum of variably negative life events occurring over a lifespan, which can shape every aspect of an individual's or a community's existence. Here's just a little copy of his book, The Trauma Spectrum, which I highly recommend. Dr. Skaer is a neurologist who spent years working with patients who had chronic pain disorders resulting from car crashes and various traumatic incidents, and he looked at the psychological effect of trauma as well as its physical sequelae. What he talks about is that the energy of hyperarousal that gets hyped up and stored in the body as a result of trauma must be used up or discharged. Otherwise, it stays trapped in the nervous system and as cellular memory, creating the potential for ongoing symptoms of physical and psychological nature for years to come. Unresolved trauma can usually really define the way people organize their subsequent perceptions about the world around them, people they meet, experiences that they have. It can actually cause an identity and an existential crisis where the person doesn't know who they are, what they believe in, what's safe, what's not safe. There are several types of traumas. There are macro traumas, which are historically defined as trauma. That's war, severe natural disasters, someone getting raped, an organized crime, a disastrous airplane crash. But then there are micro traumas. There are car accidents, risky medical interventions, childhood abuse, neglect, social discrimination, prejudice, poverty, loss or betrayal from a significant person in our lives. At a completely different level of complexity is what we call historical or multi-generational trauma, traumas that affect the life and the ability of a community to survive, to live, and to feel fulfilled and healthy. And some examples of those are genocides with the Native Americans in the Americas, what has happened in Bosnia, Kosovo, the Holocaust, Cambodia, Middle East, Zimbabwe, really any part of the world you can find evidences of historical trauma that are still affecting the way people live, the way people believe, the way people act towards themselves and towards others. Let's talk a little bit about how, as humans, we respond to trauma. So there's a reflexive survival response, which we all know quite a bit about, that is present in animals as well as humans. And there are several forms of this reflexive survival. The first one I'd like to just focus on briefly is the fight or flight response, which we're familiar with through the sympathomimetic activity, the production of epinephrine, the norepinephrine, production of cortisol in the system, basically revving up the body to either fight against whatever is harming us or flight from it. There's increased respiration, heart rate, the movement of blood away from the skin to the large muscles that are needed for running away or fighting back. And again, it allows for immediate survival. And then the other response that is evolutionarily recognized is what we call the freeze response or the immobility response. This response competes with the fight or flight, but it's also the most primitive response. It is a result of overwhelming parasympathetic vagal activity, where the heart rate slows down incredibly, respiration ceases, the blood pressure drops. This is where the person is going into shock because their emotions are so overwhelmed from what's happening to them that they almost don't feel anything. The reason they don't feel anything is that high doses of endorphins, extremely high potency painkillers, get released in the body as a result of this freeze response, as well as acetylcholine that further inhibit movement. And in the case of animals, this what makes the killing of the animal kind of a pain-free death experience. That's how evolution has kind of made this happen. And what is known is that higher states of baseline anxiety and inescapable threat environments predispose animals and humans to this freeze response. So the more stressed, the less aware, the less mindful, the less relaxed we are when something bad happens to us, it is more likely that we will go into this shock or general shutdown mode. And it is quite a common response in children due to their helplessness. They don't have the resources adults have to run away or to fight back a lot of times when bad things happen to them. And so a lot of them go into this shutdown mode. A lot of this work comes from the work of Dr. Peter Levine and his book, Waking the Tiger, in 2006, I believe. Dr. Levine actually lived in the wild for a long time in the wilderness and studied animals, wild animals, and how they respond to stress. He realized that prey animals that tend to survive in the wild display interesting energy discharge movements like trembling, shuddering, perspiring, followed by deep breathing and shaking themselves off, and eventually running off after a traumatic thing happens to them. What's interesting is that as babies, we come to the world with some of these responses. So the baby cries when a need is not being met. It screams when it's unhappy. It shakes when it's scared. But what's coming to be known through research is that a lot of us as humans, we tend to lose a lot of those natural body abilities to release this type of stress. And a lot of times it's because of societal norms and shame. So we're told, you know, it's not okay to cry because you have to be a big boy, or it's not okay to scream, or you better not yawn, or you better not shake, basically because of the structure of our society. But what happens is that as we grow older, and if we live in environments where it's not okay to express ourselves in these ways, then we tend to actually suffer from not having this natural ability to release stress. So some of those modes of energy discharge in humans that we're talking about are things like sweating, breathing, deep breathing, crying, talking, writing, vocalizing, and various forms of movement and other types of self-expression like the arts. The third response I'd like to touch base on trauma, to trauma, is what we call the tend and befriend response. This is a response that historically is thought of as the mother-child relationship, where the environment is oxytocin mediated, which is a hormone that's produced both in women and men, and it's produced much more at times when true bonding is happening. So this is how the baby, even though it doesn't really know its mother cognitively yet, through the oxytocin feels the energy of belonging and being wanted or not. The tend and befriend response is also parasympathetic nervous system mediated. It tends to restore a sense of safety in the face of danger. So the child who's running around for the first time and discovers something really scary and sees mom who is emotionally available, and the child runs to the mom and says, "Mom, help me," there is oxytocin being produced, allowing the child to feel safe in response to whatever the stressor is, cry or scream or do whatever he or she needs to do to relieve that stress, and basically go back to a wholesome nervous system and ability to react to the next stressor. And so a parent, a caregiver, a friend, a therapist, and for many of us, social and spiritual communities can actually help provide that tend and befriend response, where it's okay to feel whatever we're feeling in those environments. We're not judged, we're not yelled at, and we're not punished for being who we are. Now, the way this links us to our talk about ceremony and ritual is that ceremony and ritual have been used by indigenous communities for thousands of years as powerful means to discharge bottled up emotions for people in a structured, safe setting. And that's how a lot of communities and humans have survived. Now, a little bit about trauma psychobiology. Just that, like, the sympathetic nervous system is kind of like the gas pedal in the car, where everything revs up and we get really hyper vigilant and excited and ready to fight or flight. The parasympathetic system acts as the brakes, if we were looking at a car analogy. And the parasympathetic system is really there to reestablish that sense of safety, a relaxation in the mind and body, even after something horrible has happened and we've become really revved up. It's also responsible for getting us back to connection to ourselves, who we are, what our strengths are, our connection to nature, to other people, a sense of purpose and meaning in life. And the resolution of trauma is really dependent on multiple pre- and post-trauma factors that make up who we are before the trauma, during the trauma, how we cope with it, and then how we are able to resolve the trauma or not. And the notion of resilience has been written about and studied for a while. There are something like 33 factors from a genetic, environmental, nutritional, biological, social, emotional, and spiritual factors that make up how resilient we are at any given point in our lives. In his book, Dr. Stephen Porges, The Polyvagal Theory, The Neurophysiological Foundations of Emotions, Attachment, Communication, and Self-Regulation, he talks about the metaphor of safety and the different parts of the vagus nerve and vagal system that really help moderate how we respond to stressful experiences. So he talks about the ventral vagal system that is responsible for the safety mode. So this is where we do our best. This is where we have an optimal arousal level. We are able to be restful and do what we do well and enjoy what we're doing. And again, it's part of the parasympathetic ventral vagal system. It is what allows us to healthily engage in social activities without being mistrustful or scared of who we're interacting with and running away from them. And it's very much connected to our ability to have eye contact, our facial expressions, our vocalization, and as you can imagine, a lot of this is unconscious neurological activity. So even before we recognize who it is we're talking to, we might feel tension in our shoulders when we enter a room, or feel stressed, and we don't even know where that's coming from. And then there's kind of the yellow zone, which is the danger mode of the nervous system, which is sympathetic mediated. It's all about hyperarousal, the increase in the heart rate and the various physiological activities of the body. What we